Do you have any questions or kind of go-to things that you would say to someone to kind of get them to share something? If someone's thinking, I'm just not sure how to open the conversation.
Yeah. Yeah, no, this is hard. It's also hard for me, and I've learned this over the ways. And part of it is, smiling, a posture that suggests sort of openness as opposed to threat is really important. So how we do it is important as well. And then maybe most importantly, I'm going to give some examples of how we might open up conversations, but most importantly, it's really being interested in what people say. So there's nothing worse than you told me about racket sports a moment ago in our conversation, right? So if I say, oh yeah, you're a tennis player and a squash player. No, you told me padel and pickleball. Now you may be tennis and squash, but you said specifically pickleball and padel. So I listened and I remember that information. So Simon, pickleball, padel. And that suggests to you that I'm really leaning in, right? I'm curious about what you're telling me that's different than what other people tell me. And the interesting part of that was padel, because padel isn't a big thing in the States, but I'm guessing maybe in Australia it's become a thing. Yeah. So we could talk about that. So we start conversations lightly. We don't start with, Simon, are you married? Have you had an affair? Those aren't good opening questions, right? We start lightly. Something about what people are wearing. Shoes are good because it's not central and it's not up at the top where we kind of glaze away. Weather is a good conversation starter. Where are you going if you're on the train? Are you headed to work? Is this for fun? We start lightly, and once we engage, then it gets more, the opportunities open up. But oftentimes being interested in something that's happening in that moment, the weather, the length of the train ride, the fact that it's been taking a long time because there are a lot of stops today, or the announcements are hard to hear. Is it just me or is it you? It's that small talk that we think is silly, but that's a way that we engage someone when we can measure whether they're open to conversation or not. That works across culture, but we have to be gentle. It's a dance there, starting those conversations. With people we know, it's easier. You talk about common experiences that you have. And again, it's a bit of a dance. We don't want to start right away. So we often say to people, how are you doing, right? But in the States, the answer to that is usually good or okay. It's not a very informative question, but that's an interesting question. That's a invitation to intimacy. How are you doing, Simon? Right? And if I'm really interested, it's going to be longer than a one-word question. So we don't really start with the most intimate questions. We start with safe questions. Yeah,
and I think that fear of rejection that you mentioned earlier is a real thing. Particularly approaching a stranger, right? Someone may have done this and received a very cold response. The person that they're trying to engage with is, assuming the position of, what does this person want from me? And maybe that hasn't been such a great encounter. Is there something that you would get people to think about if that's their experience, so they have experienced this fear of rejection quite a bit and they're just not really confident in speaking to a stranger?
Well, I think it's also important. I'm imagining listeners, hearing this and thinking, well, there are some times where we don't want to talk to strangers, right? If we feel physically threatened and if we're in a place where there are not other people around, if there are gender dynamics that are going on that are scary for someone, we want to be thoughtful about who we talk to and how vulnerable we make ourselves. But assuming that you feel safe, there are all these voices in our head that we need to be dealing with. So, people usually, I'm not very good at this. I'm not a good conversation starter. People don't find me interesting. Usually when I have these conversations, I can't remember the key things, or I say things in ways that are unclear. This is the common voice that everyone has in their head. We know this from studies, and that's part of why people don't talk to strangers. So we need to kind of be brave and recognize that we may make mistakes, but if we indicate a sincere interest in the other person, they're likely to reciprocate most of the time. Not a guarantee, but most of the time, they're likely to reciprocate. So some of it is being brave, right? There's very little benefit in relationships without putting yourself out there to a certain extent. That's true even in long-term relationships in which there's been an exchange of great intimacy across years. We still need to put ourselves out there and say, this routine that we've gotten into, it's not working for me in the same way that it did 20 years ago. That's a really hard conversation to have with a partner. We need to be brave to be able to put ourselves out there in ways that feel vulnerable. Again, histories of being burned, of being mistreated in relationships make that much harder. But all of us in adulthood, regardless of our previous experiences, can continue to grow in relationships, continue to grow more brave to put ourselves out there and to be more resilient. So I might say something to you and you might say something back. And if I think about it one way, I may think, well, maybe you were kind of insulting me in a certain way, or it doesn't sound like you liked what I said, or you're making fun of me or something like that. So I could focus all my attention on the potential threats, or I could say this person doesn't really know me yet. So I probably misinterpreted what they said, actually. Again, I misinterpreted in that negative way. So being brave is part of it. And it's true for all of us, no matter how extroverted, that being in connection with others means putting ourselves out there to a certain extent, opening ourselves up.
Just to be clear, because we're kind of talking about two different things here, which do intersect: the interaction with strangers and then the building and cultivating of quality relationships. So purely the interaction with a stranger, whether that becomes a good friend long term, it is beneficial, is what I'm hearing. And it may lead to a quality relationship being built over time.
What I would say is that it may not. Like most interactions you have with a stranger on a train commuting to work, unlikely to build to a long-lasting relationship. Some might. If it's a person you've seen repeatedly over the years and you finally make a connection, they may become a buddy. And I've heard of celebrations in, train car compartments when people have birthdays with their fellow commuters. So there are those kinds of connections happen. But just the enriching nature of a momentary connection that you have with someone, when you really feel like you've exchanged meaningful things with another person, that person has understood you and been interested in you, even if it's for a circumscribed amount of time, that has benefits in the moment. It's uplifting. I think it benefits our body. It reduces our stress. So it's not that every interaction we have with a stranger is going to lead to a long-term relationship. Most won't. I'm pretty sure of that. But they can still be beneficial. During the pandemic, when the mail person would come and deliver the mail, that was the only person I got to see live for a few months, right? Besides my partner, and my kids were home for part of that as well. That was a big thing to look out the window and wave to that person and have that person wave back. We also celebrated their bravery. They were out there delivering mail despite what we thought were some of the risks at that point. So acknowledging those connections is very human. It gets us outside of ourselves and recognizing that there's a community that's bigger than ourselves. And that's different. You're absolutely right, Simon. It's different than sustained relationships that we have with each other. But that interest in other people's experience is beneficial in both contexts. That's the bridge that I'm making. So if I'm interested in the experience of other people, it's going to suit me well when I'm talking to a stranger on a train, when I'm talking to my barista, a taxi cab driver, an Uber driver, or when I'm talking to my wife, who I know pretty well. But if I'm interested in what happened to her today, what her walk was like with her friend, what they talked about, she's going to be more engaged with me, more interested in engaging with me.
When I was a kid, I remember at school and probably on cartoons, this phrase, stranger danger, which obviously has its place, but it seems that there needs to be this balance, or strike this balance between interactions with a stranger being dangerous versus interactions and showing interest in people that you don't know being beneficial to our psychology.
We obviously need to, that's what I mean by weighing the circumstances, and maybe situations as adults I'm talking about where we need to be careful about trying to make a connection with someone that we don't know. It may be a situation in which we're alone with that person, or there may be other dynamics at play that are making us uncomfortable. So of course we need to be thoughtful about the risk. It's really interesting. I've been lucky to travel, and I'm an observer of people. And for some reason, this is what's coming to mind as we're talking about this. I'm on a train in Tokyo, and it's the end of the school day. And kids as young as 4 or 5 come on the subway in Tokyo, which if you've ever been on the subway in Tokyo, it's packed with people. It's not the most comfortable place to be. Even not during rush hour, there are a lot of people on it. The kids come on, they sit in their seat, they're talking to each other, they're adorable, they're carrying their lunch boxes, they have their school uniforms on. That's a strange sight for someone from the United States. Kids commuting at that age don't commute on the public trains. We put them in buses because we think it's safer, away from other people. So different cultures navigate that stranger piece differently, right? And they have a layer of protection that's different than other places. But boy, I love that experience. I started riding the train at that time to see if the kids were going to come on the train because they were so adorable. That was uplifting for me to watch them and their interactions with each other. It's very different. It was novel because it was very different than what I experienced growing up in New York. I grew up in and around New York City, and kids from school that age don't come on the trains, the subways. It's too dangerous for them is what people think. Yeah. So of course we need to be wary of strangers, but we also need to recognize, for me in that moment, I didn't talk to those kids. My Japanese skills aren't good enough. I even was careful smiling at them because I didn't want to be intrusive and make them feel uncomfortable. But boy, I enjoyed watching them interact with each other. And I enjoyed watching the subway all look at those kids and appreciate that they were part of that community.